doing a compression test on this VG30D TT, just to make sure it's healthy just before we get really deep into this project. We don't want to waste our time getting super deep into it if the motor's no good. Here it goes. Cylinder 1. 175. Pretty good. 74. 130.
Got the Z32 in for an inspection, and also go ahead and try and fix a majority of the stuff that's not right with it. But we'll basically talk about a few things we're looking at when we do an inspection, particularly on a Z32 twin turbo and kind of inheriting somebody else's job or mess, for lack of a better word. We'll go ahead and we'll just dive in. A couple of things that we see, of course, it doesn't have any timing covers on it, which at this point is kind of a blessing because we were able to see that the timing marks aren't lined up. We've got the pulley mark on 0 on the timing cover, and we can see that essentially bank 1 of the engine, both cams, intake and exhaust are off, at least a tooth, and bank 2 intake cam is off about a tooth. The exhaust cam on bank 2 looks to be right on, so we've got these 3 cams that are off. So we're gonna have to pull all that stuff apart, fix it, get the marks lined up, and then when we're in there we can address any issues with cam seals, improper or inferior quality parts that were installed as well. We'll also be, take a look here, it's got an original coolant temp sensor. You can tell because it's red. It's just a good idea to replace them while we're gonna be in there. Get a new one, a genuine Nissan one. They're blue. And then, you know, we'll look here, you can see some of the fuel lines are routed right up against the cover and right alongside the throttle. So the throttle's not going to open correctly, you know, and you can see that this guy is all jammed up as it is. So on this car, pull the manifold off. It has the 300-degree style fuel rails, which I haven't seen in a really long time. And we'll basically move these lines to the back and use a hose to join the rails together. You can see there's missing hardware on the intake manifold. We've got the coil packs out. We did a compression test. So what we like to do is always perform a compression test on these things to get an idea what condition the engine's in, right? So we don't want to start doing a lot of work if the engine's not healthy. You know, it just wouldn't make sense to fix everything if the engine's gonna have to come out and get rebuilt, right? Compression on this one was decent. It wasn't the best, but not enough to warrant having to redo it. I think it's a brand new engine that has been rebuilt, but since it hasn't run, and of course the timing belt not being on, we're not really getting a good values and good data. So once all that stuff gets fixed, get it broken in, get it warmed up, probably recheck the compression in probably 500 miles, maybe 1,000, just to see where it stands. Here, you'll see that's you know, the regulator's not mounted correctly. It's got an aero motive, which they're good units, the A1000. It's just they're pretty big units that fit under the hood of a Z32. There's not a lot of room. And this car's not crazy modified. It doesn't have twin pumps. We can run a stock regulator, kind of have a really clean setup, putting the regulator back here and putting back the damper. You can see the damper's not in there. Reinstall the damper. We talked about that. It's just really good to have a damper in place when you can put it in. It's not 100% requirement, but I like to run them. We've got some hoses that are kind of out of place. This fitting here, this fitting's for the clutch booster. The twin turbos have a clutch booster. You can see this fitting is just pointed straight up. So that needs to be fixed. Some of these hoses are cracked. This one doesn't even appear to be the factory style hose. So you can see the routing for the flex fuel sensor. You know, all this stuff needs to be cleaned up. The dipstick tube, I think, doesn't want to play nice and go back in. So that's going to be fun. So This engine is a JDM style engine that was used, I guess, for the rebuild. You can tell because of the fitting on the corner over there. That's the brake booster fitting on a JDM engine. Everything's on the right hand side, so you have your brake booster fittings that all come up over here. The PCB stuff, we need to address that, of course. We don't want a Sharpie in the hose. I had noted that you know, a lot of the vacuum hoses are original, so I'm also not a huge fan of silicone coolant hoses, but it'll work. This car is running an AEM standalone ECU, so the way that some of the wiring was routed is right where the AC drain hose is for the evap system for it, condenser, and it's just right next to the downpipe. So this stuff is going to melt in no time. So you got to reroute all that stuff, reroute the wastegate hoses for the boost controller. So all right, guys, we've got the Z32 up in the air. We'll take a look underneath. You can tell that it was probably driven in the wintertime, somewhere in the Midwest or East Coast. You can see the aluminum on the diff cover is very oxidized. The iron is pretty rusty. Subframe is rusting pretty good. You'll notice that the subframe bushing on the right rear of the subframe is leaking. So these are liquid filled, like a thick syrupy goo that the bushings are filled with. So that one's gone bad. Over here, the HICUS has been deleted, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to have further issues. What ends up happening is guys will install, you know, a delete bar like this, but they won't pay much attention to the inner ball joints and the outer ball joints. So in this particular car, if we come over here and we grab this, you're going to see that the outer ball joint has a decent amount of play. So that's going to move the tire in and out, which you definitely don't want. So HICUS got a bad rap, but usually if it's not well maintained is why. So definitely notorious for the inner ball joints to go bad on the Z32. Outer ball joints, because these cars are pretty old now, you're gonna have those guys go bad. So this side is got a little bit of play as well. See how I can just grab it? It's might be tough to see it, but there's a bunch of play here. So that one's bad as well. All right, so you can see some of the rust that's gotten to the subframe. So something that, you know, should be addressed in the future. Remove the subframe, have a professional prep it, get rid of as much of the rust, and see if it's still safe to use. And then, you know, I would probably recommend powder coating it if it's salvageable to help prevent it from happening. This car has a one-piece drive shaft, so that's been replaced. At one point, no center support bearing anymore. So usually you would see the center support bearing right in here. It doesn't have one, so it looks like it's could be a steel drive shaft. This thing has a solid transmission mount. I'm not a big fan of them just because they transfer a horrendous amount of what's called NVH, noise, vibration, harshness. So you're gonna basically feel everything just going through the body. So I would prefer, you know, for a street Z32 application, the factory transmission style mount. Oh, this car has an aftermarket slave cylinder. Some of this stuff isn't secured properly. This is a JDM engine. You can tell by the oil filter tree that's used. The oil pressure sensor's pretty darn old. We'll see if it gets a oil pressure reading. On something like this, if it's a fresh engine, we'll put a snap-on external oil pressure gauge just to verify oil pressures are good. Seeing a motor mount nut, and the motor mount isn't in place correctly. So there's tabs. Nissan uses tabs to locate the motor mount onto the subframe. So That'll need to be fixed. Put a nut on it. We're missing some transmission bolt hardware here. So there's a bolt that goes here, and a bolt that goes on this side. And then this bracket's gonna have to get loosened up so it can line up to the bolt hole. Oil pan's a little rusted. You can tell it's been beat up a little bit. It's pushed in a little bit, but it's not horrendous. Hopefully, again, verifying we have oil pressure will make sure that the pickup tube isn't up against the bottom of the pan. We got aftermarket oil cooler hoses. Not a big deal. In fact, Nissan just discontinued one of these hoses, which is a bummer. But looks okay all in all. This oil drain hose will definitely need to get fixed. It's just up against this oil pressure sensor, and we don't want it. You don't want any of these lines to be kinked for the oil drain. You know, it could bring up smoking issues with the turbo, and it won't drain back, so the oil just backs up back into the center section, and you'll start getting smoking. Either it'll come out through the exhaust, and if it doesn't come out of the exhaust in smoke form, it can actually get into the intake side, and you get oil getting into the inlet of all that stuff. So, line up to put this thing on TDC, and it's just missing the lower radiator fan shroud. This style of radiator doesn't have a provision to bolt the lower fan shroud in place, so what I like to do with them is carefully drill a little hole to at least secure it, and then you'll see that, you know, the hose clamps that are being used on some of this stuff is way too long, so we'll get rid of these clamps. And the car has no air conditioning, so it's probably done maybe to save weight, or it was probably designed maybe to be a track car to get rid of stuff like that. So a little bit of work to do on this one. Another good thing to check on the suspension is the tension rods. This car has aftermarket bushings in it, so they're pretty good, but common area here is for these bushings, just like the subframe bushing we pointed out in the back. These have a liquid filled bushing, and they'll crack, they'll split, you'll have a ton of play, and if it's something fresh that's just happened, you'll have that nasty goo dripping, and you'll wonder, you know, is that oil? What is that? But it's just this bushing that's, you know, split and left its guts everywhere. To do a solid style tension rod, so something from Power Tricks or SPL, we'll use something like that instead of the bushing style. Some of the old aftermarket bushings, they didn't allow the tension rod to pivot, and it could actually create a lot of stress on the lower control arm and crack it because it doesn't have the give it needs. So another place to check here is definitely if it has that style of bushing. This one doesn't, but it's good to check where these nuts bolt to the lower control arm, make sure that area isn't cracked. At the Z32 at chest level here, the wheel, and what we want to check is to see if there's any play in the wheel bearing and also in the upper control arm. So this one has factory upper control arms. They appear to be original. So we're going to grab the tire at the 12 and 6 o'clock position and just tug back and forth. So this one's nice and tight, which is good. So wheel bearing's good, more than likely, and then we don't have play on the upper control arm. So we'll do that all the way around just to make sure we don't have any play anywhere. This is part of the Hicus issue. You can see, if you can get this, look at how much that wheel and tire move. That whole assembly is just moving. All right. And then there's a little bit of play from the 12 and 6 o'clock position as well. So best thing to do is fix the Hicus ball joints and then check it again to make sure that the wheel bearing isn't also bad. Thing to check as well on the Z32 when you've got it up in the air is you want to check the frame rail areas. So you can see this poor thing's been jacked up, not correctly, and all this stuff has been pushed in. And here too, you can see this thing had a rough life where people were jacking them up right here on the pinch. And you can also tell if it's been in a serious accident, because usually they will grab, the body shops, the frame shops will grab from here with their machines to hold it. And so you'll usually see a crimp, an area where it was crimped down. I don't see it on this one. You can see how it's been pushed up here. I mean, the frame rail is almost non-existent on this one. It's almost been flattened and pancaked. You know, you can see the difference from here to here, right? So this section's in pretty good shape. Again, somebody not knowing how to jack up a Z32 did it all over here, and this goes into the fenders as well, so a fair amount of body work would be required to fix all this stuff. So clips over here, so but yeah, some stuff you want to look out, and this is where all your fuel and some of the brake lines run. And on the earlier hydraulic Z32s, the Hikis lines run through here. And this car, of course, has had the Hikis deleted. Area, if you want to see if it's been in accident damage, if the car's ever been rear-ended, is you want to also look at the frame rail back here. So if the car had a big impact in the back, you'll see this is going to be all damaged and crinkled up. So this is good, so that's a good sign. Over here too, looks pretty good. Doesn't appear to be in a serious rear end damage, so that's good.